This panel this afternoon is really about looking at kind of how K-12 is transitioning from a traditional classroom to more like an unclassroom where every student is immersed in personalized and digital curriculum. And the question is, are those students ready to succeed on college campuses? Are the college campuses ready to meet the students' digital expectations? And we're very, very fortunate to have facilitating this discussion Joseph South, who is the Chief Learning Officer of IMS partner ISTE, who previously served as the Director of the Office of Educational Technology at the U.S. Department of Education. So let's welcome Joseph and our panel.
So I'm really excited to be here. I go to a lot of conferences in the educational technology world that are pretty nerdy, but I'm pretty sure this is the apex of nerdiness on the conference circuit. And when it, yeah, round of applause for that. And when I think about, what happened to the kids I hung out with in high school, I'm pretty sure they're here in this room. So welcome. I'm excited about the conversation today. At ISTE, I'm the Chief Learning Officer, and ISTE is a K-12 organization that is a membership organization, and we really look at how can you use technology effectively in classrooms. And we have what's called the ISTE standards, and we're always looking at using technology in the most transformative ways possible. And I'm really excited about this panel because we're really talking about taking that transformation and moving it beyond K-12, looking at the connections between that and higher education. We'll get into that in just a minute, but I want to make sure we introduce the members of our panel. So I'm just going to briefly ask you to introduce each one of you, and we'll start here with Wendy.
Okay. Hi, I'm Wendy Oliver. If you're an oldie but a goodie in the room, I know you from when I founded and ran the State of Tennessee's online learning program, E for Tennessee. I am now with Arizona State University Prep Digital, and we're positioned uniquely to have a network of charter schools that are K-12, and they create a pathway into the university. So it's an exciting program, and I'm the Chief Learning Architect overseeing product development.
Hi, I'm Jack Soos. I'm Vice President of IT at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Chair of the IMS Global Board.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd Brown, Executive Director for Information Technology with Baltimore County Public Schools.
And John Mott, I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Learning Objects.
Great. So we have a number of perspectives here that are going to, I think, provide us some insight into these crossover issues. But to set this up, I want to talk a little bit about a tsunami that's hitting right now. And I use that in the most technical ways possible. As you know, a tsunami travels along the bottom of the ocean, and it's essentially invisible until it gets right up onto the shore, at which point it looms vastly large and destroys everything in its path. The tsunami that's happening right now is in our K-12 schools. 5 years ago, 30%, a little less than 30% of our schools had broadband in their classroom. Today, we're up over 90%. So this is the first time that schools writ large have reliable access to the bandwidth that they need in their classroom to truly transform their teaching and learning using digital tools. And so the changes that we're about to see are much greater than we may be anticipating. To set this up, we want to show a brief video of an actual school in Baltimore County that Lloyd works with, and give you a sense of what's happening in that school, and ask you to picture what these students are going to be like when they graduate and they go to college, and what their expectations might be. So could we show the video, please?
One of the major changes occurring as we shift to our digital learning platform is the move toward learner-centered environments. Today we'll take a look inside a learner-centered classroom and see what that means for teachers and students.
Learner-centered environment is really the heart of the transformation for teaching and learning because it takes into account the teacher's role and the way teachers interact with curriculum and with students.
We are really raising learners who know that they have a responsibility when they arrive on the doorstep of the school, and they are responsible to make sure that they've learned They're evaluating their learning, they're creating rubrics to talk about how much they've learned, to measure their success.
We have transitioned to a learner-centered environment which really has empowered our students. It has provided them an opportunity to be who they are, where they are in the classroom. It has removed artificial barriers that we had prior to, where it may have been the teacher's space and we were fitting the children into that. Now it's the student's space and we're facilitating the learning.
We always think of a learner-centered environment as the room that when you walk into it, you can't find the teacher. Because the teacher takes into account everything that students are bringing into the classroom. They use the information, their unique skills, their unique gifts, their talents, their culture, and they take what they know and they create an environment that is responsive to those students.
I like choosing where I like to sit and read because, like, where you like to sit, you can get on a beanbag or on a stool where you can just relax and do some work.
I think the expert in the classroom just gives me a little more freedom as a teacher to work with my small groups and my students who need a scribe or a reader for their accommodations. The expert is there as kind of a step before coming to the teacher.
You can walk into any classroom at any given time and see a blended environment, paper pencil tasks, novels, text, computers. Students are engaged at a variety of different levels.
The technology is cool because we can always check on how our grades are going and how we're doing in class.
Each learner gets what they need and they get the support that they need in the small group that they need. We want students to take ownership and responsibility and become lifelong learners and determine how they best learn, and this is allowing them to do that.
We're preparing children for a world that we don't really know about yet, and we don't know the jobs that are going to exist, the technologies that are going to exist. So we're creating critical thinkers now. We're creating problem solvers. We're creating opportunities for children to collaborate.
Everything feels different. When we walk into classrooms now, the language of the classroom has changed. The classroom is about the children.
All right. So Lloyd,
Yes.
tell us a little more about that environment that you've created there and how it's changed the way both the educators and the students think about their roles.
What I hope you'll realize is from the footage is independent learning and student using digital content is not always on the computer. Did you notice that? It was all kinds of different tools and resources. It's not all about IT. But one of the things that we started, and the reason I wanted to show you the elementary side of the house, is because we started with our one-to-one initiative and our STAT initiative in our grades 1, 2, and 3. And now we're completely kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. So as our kindergarten students have grown for the last 5 years, they're in 5th grade now, and we are seeing huge changes about how they conduct themselves with their learning. They're now taking ownership of how they learn, when they learn, using the resources that they need to learn. And the IT world it gives them the ability to search and use that as a resource whenever they need it, when they need it. Not that I'm sitting a student in front of a screen for 6 hours during the day and saying, go at it. So one of the things that we really emphasized on in our digital conversion was more than IT. It was about changing curriculum, changing the way we teach, our teachers using resources that they've never used before, putting students in groups, letting them work. Because I can tell you, just bring it to what we do today in our adult life. Do you always sit at your desk and make all the decisions? No, we try to collaborate, bring all the different resources together. We have experts in the field, we all talk, then we come up with a solution. So that's what we're really focusing on with our digital conversion, to make sure students and teachers are all learning together, because we are in the business of learning. So the biggest piece is trying to make sure we give them the tools, and you see in a video of multiple tools, to make sure they are successful. And I can tell you from starting in elementary schools and going into high schools, now when we get our high school students in, it is going to have a huge impact on our higher education. And that's why we're looking at trying to figure out ways that Baltimore can help our local higher education institutions to be prepared for it, because I don't think any of us are.
Wendy, in your schools, how has the expectations of students changed about learning?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is it isn't necessarily what the expectations, how the students have changed, it's how administration and how teachers have changed, because the students are teaching us, right? And a lot of that is flipping that locus of control so that it is very student-centered. And I like how the video ended and it said, now it is student-centered, right? And we've all talked about the sage on the stage and how we're changing that. And as we shift to the technologies that we now have, we're able to see now it's no longer that the teacher's necessarily in control of the learning, it's the student, and the student owns his or her learning. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about data, but that's a significant shift. And it's almost as if this idea that we've had for years around the student being the center, we've had this idea, but we really haven't had the technology to allow the student to own his or her data. But now they're coming together, and we're approaching not only the pedagogy side of the house, but we're also approaching the technology side to allow that to happen with some significant technologies such as blockchain, and those are moving into the environment. So I think it's really exciting, and we're at a culminating opportunity for a big push in education.
So Jack, you are going to receive the students that are being prepared by Lloyd and by Wendy. How does that make you feel, and is higher education ready for these students?
Well, the good news for me is I'm going to probably retire in the next 6 or 7 years. So by the time his 5th graders are hitting, that's just about perfect timing. So thank you. What I got a chance, Lloyd and I, being in the same vicinity, I got a chance to see this firsthand last year, and it was an eye-opener. One of the things that it made me think about is the fact that, no, we aren't ready. I mean, you could go into a calculus class and it looks like the calculus class I took in 1976. It's a lecture hall, it's students sitting, taking notes on paper. If you're using a calculator, you are probably doomed in that class because they're designed that you should have memorized the formulas for how you do trigonometric substitutions and algebraic manipulations. And we wonder why we have problems in some of these introductory STEM courses. So the answer to your question is no, I don't think higher ed is ready yet. And I think that this is one of those topics that your tsunami is a great metaphor for. Where I have some hope is that where we started to do active learning and other aspects 10 years ago, the feedback that we were getting from students was, they don't like this. This is too hard, because they hadn't seen it in K-12. We were asking them to come to class fully prepared to engage. My hope is that as we're seeing active learning instilled in the K-12, it'll be more opportunistic for instructors to start using it, because that's what their students are going to want and going to expect. And so that's the hopeful side of this equation as we look forward.
So one of the areas that has really frustrated me, and you touched on it a little bit, Wendy, is the incredible lack of transfer of what we know about students from K-12 to higher ed and from higher ed to workforce. It boggles my mind that we can interact with a student for 12 years for 6 hours a day and pass on to higher ed a GPA and an essay and maybe an SAT score, which we know only predicts their first year in college.
If that.
If that. That is ridiculous to me. I'm wondering, John, and from everyone, but what can we do here? How can we open up the floodgates of data and start allowing this data to move in a way that will benefit the students and the institutions?
Well, as a panel, we haven't been very geeky yet about the data, so I guess I'll pick up that baton. As I watch the video and as I think about what's happening in K-12, it looks a little chaotic, right? But I'm guessing that there's a little bit of structure and process and system and data collection behind the scenes, right? So we know which learners are working on which outcomes and which ones are on track and which ones are behind. Like you're saying, Joseph, that we know a lot of things about these learners that we spend 12 years with. I know in some states there are some initiatives to hand off that data a little more effectively to higher ed and say, okay, this is the student you're getting. Here's a little bit more insight about them that might help you prepare to help them succeed. There's also a lot of initiatives where there's concurrent enrollment. So by the time I'm in high school, maybe I'm actually taking some college courses and getting used to what that mode of learning might be like. But I still think, to your point, there's a massive opportunity to figure out, like, are we measuring the things that matter during K-12, and are we packaging them up in a way that are readily consumable by folks in higher ed, and are the folks in higher ed ready to receive that and consume it? So it's a question of standards, obviously. We want to get the data easily movable and machine readable, but it's more fundamentally like, are we asking and collecting the right data, and in higher ed, are we ready to receive and act on it?
Yeah, what we're looking at inside of Baltimore is really starting that conversation with our local higher education groups. Is really, we do have students now that are taking early enrollment in college courses starting in 10th grade in a lot of places. So with that, we're trying to work with them to start identifying meaningful data that they would need to help them go through to the college level. So one of the things that we're doing is some of us in the K-12 probably will realize this, is an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. So we're building those standard data sets now with 2 of our local folks in higher ed to kind of see if that is the data that they need to make sure that the student's going to be successful in the college setting. We have very unique partnership with CCBC, which is 2 of their campuses are right next door to 2 of our high schools. So our high school students are definitely going in and doing dual enrollment inside of those campuses, and they don't have to go anywhere. So a lot of that information and data is currently being transferred. But again, I think I want to go back to your point, is making sure we have meaningful data.
Right.
There's a lot of data. The chaos is there. We collect a lot of data about where the students are, what they're doing, how they're doing, attendance, and so on. But the biggest piece is, what does higher ed need to really understand what that child's going to do when they get to their setting? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And I would suggest it's more than what does higher ed need, is what does the student need as a universal learner as they move through from high school, elementary to middle to high school, to the university level, and even into the workforce. So, you know, as we look at, and I'm positioned in a different situation where I'm, you know, high school, trying to prepare students to transition from a high school directly into a university. And so as we look to reduce time to diploma because we want to reduce student debt, you know, what are those skills and competencies and badges that they can award and that they can receive in the workforce? And even when we look internationally, it may be that they're not trying to get a college degree, but they're trying to get badges for work skills. You know, who owns that, and how do we transfer that information? And it's really completely flipping that model where I don't think that the school owns that. I don't think that the university owns that. I think the digital transcript and all those data components belong to the lifelong learner, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's where the technology is allowing us to change that model. And it's going to be a significant change in allowing the learner to flip, and now I have control of who I release that data to. A significant difference when they want to make changes in their life or they want to do different things.
I think from a higher ed perspective, there's sort of 2 different pieces where data can flow and be helpful. So on one side, what's going to be very interesting in the next couple of years is, as Lloyd's saying, instead of students taking AP classes, they're just signing up in 10th grade for American history, 1865 to the present, History 102, if you remember it in your university. Now they're taking it at the community college, they're going to transfer that, but they may be a 10th grader where they're transferring that. We may see them 2 years later and be wondering, well, where did they learn history, or what was going, you know, it's a completely different sort of thing, and we're going to need to understand in the transcript, did they learn it in K through 12? Did they learn it in the community college? How is that going to bear into what we can expect them to bring into the next class that they're going to be taking? Because we will be accepting that as credit. That's mandated by the state. And so that isn't a question, but it's what will we need to be helping with to be making sure that that's there. Likewise, I think that higher ed can give back a lot of data that can be helpful for understanding how effective your instruction is. We had a Gates program with the community colleges where we give back information to the community colleges on how students who transferred to UMBC did. And this is helping us make sure that our curriculums are aligned and that students are coming fully prepared. I think we're going to need to be doing the same thing with the K-12 area. And one of the things that's going through my mind is that we're just on the cusp of being able to do things where I run an adaptive learning placement test that allows me to understand what aspects you didn't learn. If I can be giving that back by county or by school, that's going to be incredibly important for understanding how's your curriculum training going. Are there certain places where you're not doing as well because your students can't do certain kinds of math problems effectively? If we can get that data and share it, we can really be making a difference and giving a feedback loop to everyone on things.
So one of the areas that I think starts to emerge when you start to think about this data transfer and what you need to know is usually what you need to know is not whether they've memorized a particular theorem or they know a particular date. What you need to know is what their competencies are in these different subject matter areas. And if you think about, school's been, arrayed around subjects for a very, very long time. But now if you look at what's being expected of K-12 schools, in addition to learning the subject matter, you also have to learn social emotional skills because you can't be successful without those. And then there's also these employability skills. And then there's critical thinking, whatever that is, and we can't know exactly what it is, but we know everybody needs it really badly and they need it now. How do we move this conversation from a sort of content conversation to a competency conversation? And how can we make those competencies fluid across not just K-12 and higher ed, but also the workforce?
Maybe I'll try that first. And so on the previous panel, again, I'm kind of flying the geek flag. Somebody talked about Second Life. How many of you seen or read Ready Player One? It's not Second Life, it's the Oasis, right? I mean, that's where we're heading, virtual reality and like these, and I think we can see that that's not too far off, but the here and now is focusing on more authentic experiences. And I think as we think about all of these extra skills, they're the skills and the competencies that we all need in our jobs every day. Certainly we need subject matter capability, but if we don't have the critical thinking and the communication and the teamwork skills and all of that, they're not very useful. And I think a lot of that is creating more authentic learning experiences and authentic assessments that go along with it. And there's a couple of things that we can kind of tie into that. So there's the case standard, which can start helping us map. That's the Competencies and Academic Standards Exchange, right? So if on the academic side we can map, here's what the system of competencies actually looks like, and here's where it's taught, here's how it's taught, and here's how it's assessed. That becomes a way to exchange data about that, but then we can layer on top of that the more authentic experiences and assessments. I think that's a path forward.
Other thoughts on aligning those three?
Well, back to the prior panel, I think we have to be thinking much more broadly around credentials and badging and how to be looking at this, the idea of blockchain or whatever we're going to do. It's clear that no one institution summarizes fully or even significantly all of the learning that a person does over the course of their lifetime. And if we're not able to be finding ways where we can give and empower learners to be able to be collecting this information and then presenting it back, we're doing a disservice. And so I think that requires all parties, though, to be starting to come to the table with how we're going to be thinking through this and starting to do this. But I think that's absolutely essential over the next year or two if we're going to make progress on this.
And I would just add what Jack was saying, to really start concentrating on the student. The student learning is what we need to help them understand of how they're going to move through and how critical thinking, how communication, how presentation skills, all those things work together. And as they're moving along, the learning to be able to be in a position to where they own their own data, as we discussed earlier, and they know how they're going to use that data to be that next person after in higher ed. So that's where I think, how many of you use Naviance? Does anybody use Naviance out in the field? Naviance is one of the applications where we're starting to look at is how do we start using that program to help a third grader start trying to figure out where they want to go in higher education. So that if we can start somewhat putting a roadmap to help them understand this is what you need to do. Let's say you want to be a rocket scientist. These are the things that have to happen for you to be there. So if we can start as K-12 as really starting, and we do a good job of that because, I mean, we have a lot of CTE programs that are for our students. They have, work experience through all that. But the biggest piece is I think sometimes they're not sure what they want to do and how they need to get there. So helping them decide, and with the data that they have, owning the data, owning their learning, and owning their path is where we need to help. And then that's where higher ed comes in to help us, is saying, what do we need to make sure they're ready for? Because I can tell you that sometimes we hear from our local higher eds, well, your students aren't coming to us prepared. Well,
I've never heard that.
We need to figure this out, because if we're doing all this hard work and they're still telling us that the child's gone through 12 years of K-12 and they're not prepared, that's a little disturbing to me. So we've got to figure this out as a K-12 organization.
So one thing I'll add is, we see the previous panel, and then we're hearing it again in this one, the traditional course has to shift and has to change, and I think that was an excellent point. But how do we do that and still meet our accreditation requirements? So that's a high school comment, right? How do we meet that, right? So we've pushed in the online learning world and environment to get to competency-based education, to get to mastery-based learning, and that's been approved in multiple states. But then when you walk into higher ed, and as someone who has been in that space, and someone who is kind of in that PhD ivory tower is what people often refer to us, that kind of snobby approach of, well, you didn't do all of this, or you didn't do your coursework, or et cetera, et cetera. When you start thinking outside of the box, there's an academic snobbery that comes down, and I've been guilty of that myself. So again, as we start thinking outside of the box, sometimes we're our own worst enemies of what does that really mean in education. And I think, we're going to redefine what does this look like. What does it look like to master these competencies? And what is a class? Where do you learn and how do you measure that? I just spent 45 minutes on a conference call defining what does measurement really look like for a standard. And I joked and said, seriously, is this what we're talking about? But, in reality, that matters in education. So we're going to define this outside of the box. If it's not a traditional course, we're past 133 seat hours, but then what does it mean and what does it look like? And then translate that into higher ed as well. And so it is a completely different experience, but we, as the folks in this room, have to have open minds and not turn our noses up to, oh, they're not really doing that, right? So I think that's important to remember.
One thing I would just add as we talk about it, and it's just, if I was channeling my vice president of student affairs, what she would say is that as we start thinking about this competency model and other aspects, we are going to have 20% or more of our students who are really high performing but feel they have to do everything. And what ends up happening, and you see these at, they're majoring in 3 different majors. They're doing extracurricular activities that, one of the things that can happen in this world where we give so many options is we end up stressing out young people, whether they're in high school or whether they're in college. And so I also hope that as part of this, we don't always think more is better, but we're figuring out how we can be advising that sometimes less is more.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're starting to hit on, a really important aspect of this, and that is the human side, right? So we talk about there's technological barriers to this kind of sharing and this kind of transferability. and then we have to agree on the standards, right? But that all lives in sort of one part of this world. Then there's the other part of this world, and that's the humans in the system, right? If you don't get the humans on board, then none of this is going to happen. And it is interesting to watch a classroom that's been truly transformed with technology. It takes a while, and we often say that the first stage of your digital transformation is chaos, right? Because the students are like, what are we doing? What are our expectations? Tell me what to do. And you're like, no. This is yours now. You can step up to this. And then they start to settle in. Collectively, there's a lot of policy that gets involved here, right? And this is how we sort of govern what we do and how we do it. And I know from work at the federal level how powerful policy can be as a lever of change, and how crushing it can be as a barrier to innovation. So from a policy point of view, what do we need to do? What are the implications of this world? What needs to be different? How do we need to move on the policy front, whether at the federal, state, or school level, or institutional level, to support these kinds of shifts?
I'll give one a try. And I'm trying to think in my head how this connects to policy. So you're policy guy, so you tell me how this fits. But I mean, one of the things that Lloyd was talking about is enabling learners to have a little bit more ownership of their data. And this could be a policy issue. I know when you were at Department of Ed, you worked on this, like portability of data. And there's a lot of buzz. It's buzzwordy right now to talk about blockchain and verifiable claims and self-sovereign identity. But what all of that means to me at the end of the day is like, we have to respect learner agency and their ability to own and curate their own data and their own accomplishments, and then use that as they traverse their learning path. So as they go from K-12 maybe to multiple post-secondary institutions and ultimately into the workforce and continue to learn, I don't know if there's exactly a policy issue or if it's the government could maybe enable and support some processes where data becomes more portable, or maybe I have a right to my data, I can download it, take it with me. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that get into that mix, but I like your emphasis on the human part of it, and putting the student as an agent at the middle of that, I think, is key.
Yes, and also, I mean, policy with a big P and policy with a small p, just like data sharing agreements,
Fair enough.
right?
Yeah.
And both levels.
And that's what I was going to bring up, is just keeping it at a local level, just talking about data sharing between our partners and the school system, is what we're really looking at is having a data sharing agreement between our vendors and providers to make sure that we're identifying what data you're getting and what data you really never need to see or get. And so a lot of our partners right now are starting to say, well, I want this data, let's just say Title I data, and I'm like, well, what are you going to use that data for? And so they're trying to struggle with that. So we're really working with our partners now to say, look, here is our data sharing agreement. This is the data we're willing to give to you about a student and this is a school system. So this is where we sign our policy basically with you to make sure that we're sharing the information we need to share and only the information that needs to be shared. So we're containing what we are sharing, and that's where the integration starts coming, because then now we're using unique identifiers versus the student name and birth date and all this stuff, so that we can just start tying all that data back together.
Yeah, and
so that is one area of policy that
yeah, and really quickly on this could be a policy issue, big or small, but if a vendor is recalcitrant or hesitant to give you or your students data about student learning, time to get a new vendor. Not that I have an opinion about that.
So I would agree with Lloyd that at the small p level, if we can't begin sharing data, then we have a real problem, especially when you're a public university in the same state as a county that has got a K-12. And so that clearly is one of the areas where we should be spending time, and we need to be motivating our campus councils and or the county councils, lawyers, to be able to come together, because it's we know we're not going to be using this data for profit. So we ought to be able to be finding ways that we can be sharing that with one another. And I think that's a key win. I would say at the higher ed space, we have historically benefited from the fact that we get very smart people from K through 12. They come to universities, they spend 4 years there, they learn quite a bit, but they came very smart, and then they go on and they do powerful things. As we're starting to see that education is changing and we're trying to grow the pool of people who have college credentials, I think that we're going to need to be much more explicit around student learning outcomes in our courses. And we often expect faculty to cover everything, and they know that most students are not mastering the content that they get, that they may only be memorizing things for an exam or bringing forth one or two elements into what they actually learn and are ready to master for the next course that they're in. This needs to be much more explicit. And so I think this idea of how we think about curriculum in higher ed is probably one of the big areas that higher ed will need to face, because we've never had to face it like K through 12 has had to face it. We've been able to do it completely ourselves, but we've never quite mapped it to the same level.
So I'm not necessarily going to touch on policy, but I want to go.
It's okay. It's not everybody's first love.
Okay. I want to go a different direction and to curriculum in higher ed. And I'm just going to take a guess that you did a lot of professional development with your teachers so that they could, with your first through third grade, I believe you said, so that they would be able to prepare them to teach in the way in which we saw. And that brings me to the point that I don't think, and I'm not going to get off on a tangent here, but I don't think that higher ed really is preparing our teachers to teach our students in the way that they need. And I think that's something else that we could spend a whole day on, and that would be a completely different panel. But I couldn't leave this stage without saying that, that when we look at the trends and what's changing, and we keep talking about data, and data is so important. And what I have learned is, unless we can present the way in which, Maya, you'll be proud of me, data is actionable. And I always say, unless we can train teachers on how to read the data and what to do with it. But I don't think we're doing that well. So just to say, that's a very important part.
Great. So we are slightly ahead of schedule. So I'm going to take a minute and just open it up to questions from the audience. Is there any burning thoughts or questions that you have?
Well, it definitely will have to happen. Training is, professional development is one of the key things that we put in our budget every year to make sure is happening. One of the other things that we really concentrated on is that we needed to have a certified teacher, an FTE, in every single school to make this happen. So every instructor is a certified master teacher. Now that his or her job is strictly to teach teachers how to incorporate the new digital conversion in their classroom. So that's in every single classroom, or every single school, sorry. So that was one way that we did it. Then we also took it as being a train-the-trainer model, which then you're correct. We still have some teachers that are, high flyers, and some that are still saying, get the technology out of my room. So we're still working that out. And then, of course, over time, those folks start seeing the benefit, and that's where we really started using our high flyers to bring from all different schools and bring them into those schools to see how it's actually working. So that's how we created our first lighthouse schools, and they were the fish bowls. So all the teachers in the elementary schools went to those 10 schools to see how it actually works in the classroom. And having the intensive professional development right behind it, having that individual in the school, has helped us maintain and move the things going through. And I'll have to ditto what was said earlier about we're having teachers now that are graduating out of higher ed coming into K-12 that is not prepared for that. So we can reverse the same statement that he does to me is our students aren't prepared. Well, your teachers you're training are not prepared. So those are things we have to look at and have communications about, because all K-12 organizations are going to run into that same problem. If you're doing this conversion and doing student-centered learning, the teachers that are being taught in higher ed is not ready for that setting when they come to K-12. So those are things that we're working, but your professional development is key on the list. I don't know if you ever saw our 8 conversions, but our organizational development is in there, and it's completely about how do we make sure, and unfortunately or fortunately, we do have to pay them. So budget is high. So those are kind of things in the Union State that we are in Maryland, we have to pay our teachers for everything that we do with them. So we need to make sure that it's there and give them that opportunity.
So I would say sort of in a policy part, and higher ed is starting to grapple with this, but I think we have to be pressing faster in this area. Is the first thing that we need to be doing is making sure that every PhD that is, or graduate student that's going to graduate, who is expecting to go to a university has had some experience as part of being a graduate student in learning some of the best methods and best practices around teaching in that domain. We spend very little time historically working with faculty on how to teach better. We spend a lot of time teaching them how to research, how to be good scholars, but we don't spend as much time on preparing them in the classroom. And I think that's an area that we have to sort of recognize we're going to need to spend more time on and develop ways to be doing that. And that's something that I think can happen. To your point, we were talking in the higher ed group yesterday, and we actually believe that our departments of education, as they're getting this feedback about our graduates and about how things are changing, they need to help be advocates for change within the academy, that they should be front and center of seeing what the students they place in the classroom are experiencing, what they need to know, and be bringing us back, that information to say, hey, there's some changes afoot, you're going to need to be working more. And I think that's an area where probably looking at how accreditation occurs at the K-12 area for K-12 teachers and for K-12 teaching programs is probably an area that we can benefit from.
Yeah, and just from ISTE's point of view on this one, we have these standards that outline competencies for transformative teaching and learning with technology, and we've actually seen a demand for certification in those standards. So we're presently developing a certification in the ISTE standards because that knowledge is not happening, it's not being created in the teacher preparation programs. So essentially we're coming in behind with in-service teachers and providing them that kind of professional learning and support. We're also seeing a demand among teacher preparation programs to have ISTE come in and start to consult with them about how can they bring these skills to their faculty and to their program. How can they be an ISTE recognized teacher preparation program? So I think there's starting to be an awakening in the teacher preparation realm that this is something that's missing and that it matters that it's missing, and they're starting to look for solutions. Not as fast or as broadly as we would hope, but it's the tsunami, I think, is, maybe it hasn't hit them yet, but the waves went way out and there's a lot of fish flopping around and they're a little worried about what might happen next. Yeah.
So maybe, Chris, I'll just address briefly from like a higher ed point of view. So I worked for a long time at a university trying to convince faculty to be innovative, and the last 10 years been doing that sort of from a vendor partner perspective with universities. And I'll be just a little bit provocative, like going back to the human kind of point of view. I think we have to get our university faculty to realize that maybe 1%, probably less than 1% of the students in their classes are going to be like them. Like a tiny, tiny percent are going to become research faculty members. Everybody else is going to go get a different job. I'm not going to say in the real world, because being a PhD faculty member, or researcher, is in the real world, but it's a very specialized kind of real world. And the vast majority of their students are going to do something different. So they have to have a different mindset that it's okay, it's not a dirty word to say I'm preparing these people for careers, and that as I think about that, I need to be invested in the kinds of outcomes that I try to help them achieve. And I think we're evolving there because of a lot of pressures that are being put on higher ed, and I think that conversation is progressing, but I think we need to push that harder.
Agree. Might have time for one more question if it's yep.
I think it is an important piece that and just from the IT side, I try to have at least 2 or 3 student-centered meetings with students to say basically what's working, what's not working, what's just totally ugly. So getting their input through all this is something that we, as leaders in every organization, needs to be listening to. I was going to bring that up with Jack, is, you know, really how our students react, and some of them do not even go to higher education. So we still have to prepare them for going to the workplace or going into the military. So our Baltimore Foundation group really starts talking to all the local businesses and saying, what is it that you need to see in the student? And so they also have an organization that brings students together to say, what is it that I need to focus on? The students will ask questions on, you know, it's kind of like the, where you have the career days, right? But this is a little more focused on high school students to be able to say, this is where I want to go, what do I need to do that? Because they know they're not going to go into higher ed, right? So we're trying to really try to figure out, listening to the students, get the plan from the students, help them make the plan, and then keep them moving in that direction until they decide what they want to do. So your point is exactly right on, is getting student input. We do actually, I think a lot of folks in Maryland, we actually even still have currently a student board member. So there is a student that sits on the board, and they give their opinions and does the same thing with walking and talking with other students, and they're a senior in the high school, and they come on and give us their opinions too on what's going on in policy and direction of the school system. So good point.
All right, I'm a big believer in finishing early, not late. So I'm going to give you one last chance to comment. I'm a huge fan of wait, don't tell me. I'm not going to make you finish out quite with the same pizzazz that they do. But if you can picture, you know, what is one thing that if you saw this happening, you know that we'd be doing it right. If you saw X, you know we'd be doing it right. I'll start. If every teacher entered their first classroom prepared to lead with technology rather than as a follower with technology, we would be doing it right. That's something that would show that we had made the change that we need to. What's something that if you saw in the system, you know we'd be doing it right?
I'm going to go a little bold. If us as adults can go into a classroom and listen to students and not be worried or scared that I don't have the answer.
Love that one.
Thinking a lot of different things, but I will say something very personal. If I went into a classroom and I would put my 6-year-old in it, then I know we're doing it right.
Be excited to put your 6-year-old in it.
So mine's pretty simple. If I began to see beanbag chairs in my classrooms, I'd know that we've relaxed and we're allowing students to learn the way that they want to.
I would say that, so one thing, right? I think one thing that we haven't said yet is that about half of K-12 completers aren't going to go to college. And so we could talk to any 18 to 22-year-old, and they have a plan for how to be successful in life.
Great. Thank you. With that, I'll leave it there. Thank you to the panel.
Good luck on your boards.